There are questions that seem to linger over every family that has said goodbye to a loved one. Why do some older individuals pass away peacefully, almost as if drifting off to sleep, while others face long periods of physical and emotional suffering before the end? It's not just about illness or lack of medical care. There are instances where, even with treatment and comfort, the elder seems to traverse a narrow corridor of pain and anguish, prolonging a farewell that everyone hoped would be smoother. This question has puzzled doctors, psychologists, and scholars of human behavior for decades, but it was Ian Stevenson, a researcher respected for the depth of his studies on life and death, who dared to propose hypotheses that went beyond what the eyes could see. He believed that suffering in the final days was not an accident or a punishment, but could be linked to something much deeper, a kind of invisible reckoning that many ignore throughout their entire lives. In studying accounts from patients in their last moments, Stevenson observed patterns that drew attention. Older individuals with life stories full of unresolved conflicts, silent guilt, or deep regrets seemed to face more turbulent departures. It's as if certain repressed memories came to the surface demanding recognition, like forgotten chapters of a book that cannot be closed until the last page is read. Stevenson warned that understanding this process could not only alleviate the fear of death, but also help families better cope with the final phase of those they love. That's why this video is so important, especially for you who seek clear and serene answers on this topic. If this subject resonates with you, please subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support the creation of content that brings clarity in delicate moments of life. He analyzed hundreds of testimonies, spoke with doctors, caregivers, and family members, piecing together a mosaic of stories that revealed something surprising. Many of those who suffered intensely before the end reported in moments of lucidity memories of old facts that had never been mentioned. A woman, for example, spoke of the child she abandoned 40 years ago. A man apologized for the violence he committed in his youth. These were not confessions made under the influence of medication, but persistent memories that seemed to emerge like delayed waves, finally reaching the shore. Stevenson wondered if physical pain was, in part, a reflection of the weight of these repressed emotions, a last call for reconciliation, even when it seemed too late to achieve it. The idea was not to blame those who suffered, and Stevenson always made that clear. He did not believe that final suffering was punishment, but rather a complex phenomenon, a reflection of the life that was ending. There was something profoundly human in recognizing that not everyone departs with the same lightness, because not everyone lived with the same balance. Those who left unfinished business, unspoken words, or open wounds carried that burden until the end, and sometimes that burden manifested in the body, the spirit, and even in the way death approached. For Stevenson, it was as if life offered one last opportunity to face these hidden pains, providing a space to ask for forgiveness, grant forgiveness, or simply acknowledge what had been denied for so long. In some cases, Stevenson discovered something even more intriguing. There were older individuals who, in the days leading up to death, completely changed their behavior. They became more agitated, said things that seemed nonsensical, but made perfect sense to those who knew forgotten details of their histories. A 92-year-old woman, for example, called out the name of her brother whom she hadn't seen since childhood, as if she needed to reconcile with him before passing on. An 85-year-old man asked to see the field where he grew up, even though he was confined to a hospital bed. These requests, often ignored or underestimated, were for Stevenson clear signs that the mind and soul were attempting to close old chapters, as if there was a natural need for balance before the final silence. The researcher warned that listening to these utterances, respecting these wishes, and understanding these behaviors could reduce suffering for both those who were departing and those who remained. He saw this not merely as a field of study, but as a practical mission. He believed that families, caregivers, and even doctors could intervene more compassionately, helping to make this transition less painful. Recognizing what these manifestations mean is to open a space for the elderly person to find peace, even if late. And perhaps this is one of the hidden reasons why some suffer more, because the reconciliation that did not come in life seeks its space at the time of farewell. Stevenson also drew attention to something few people considered: the impact of the environment in which the elderly person spent their last days. In his research, he noted that hospitals with cold, impersonal routines, where patients were treated like numbers, seemed to intensify the feeling of isolation and anguish. In contrast, places where there was listening, affection, and a minimum of personalization in care brought noticeable relief. The suffering didn't disappear, but it took on less harsh contours. He said that for many, physical pain was inevitable, but emotional pain could be softened with something as simple as the presence of someone willing to listen to a repeated story or hold a hand in silence. This revealed that, even in the final moments, human connections still had a real power to transform experiences, showing that the way we die is not only linked to medicine, but also to how we are treated. Another conclusion of Stevenson's was that suffering before death was deeply connected to what he called unresolved knots of life. These knots were formed by traumas, broken promises, grudges held for decades, hidden guilt, and even secrets that were never revealed. He believed that in the final moments, the body and mind worked together to try to untie these knots, even if the elder was never consciously aware of it. That's why many experienced delusions or sudden memories of forgotten facts, as if the unconscious took control and said, "It's now or never." This perception, though unsettling, carried a valuable message. If these knots were worked on during life, perhaps the suffering would be less at the time of departure. This, for him, was an essential lesson for anyone who still has time to look within and try to resolve unfinished business while they can. The account Stevenson collected showed that the pain of many came not only from the body, but from the weight of unspoken words. A mother who never apologized to a child, a man who never acknowledged a mistake, a daughter who never forgave a father. These stories repeated like an echo, and faced with the inevitable, the accumulated silence seemed to exact a price. The researcher saw a pattern. The greater the accumulation of unexpressed grievances, the more intense the turbulence of the farewell. Therefore, he insisted that speaking, listening, and acknowledging were acts that could save not only relationships, but also the very dignity of the end. He didn't preach ready-made formulas or magical solutions, but he made it clear that living consciously, caring for the bonds we create, was a way to soften the moment that everyone, sooner or later, will face. A curious aspect is that Stevenson noticed significant differences between cultures. In places where aging was respected and death was seen as a natural part of the life cycle, suffering seemed to be less traumatic. In societies that avoid talking about the end, hide their elderly and treat old age as an inconvenience, reports of painful farewells were more frequent. This showed that it was not just an individual issue, but also a collective one. The way we deal with our elders directly influences how they live the final chapters of their stories. For Stevenson, this was a reflection that demanded changes not only in families, but in society as a whole, because the culture of silence about death is often the root of pains that could be alleviated. When interviewing caregivers, Stevenson realized that many of them were, unknowingly, mediators between the elder and the knots that needed to be untied. They'll touch, an attentive look, a simple question like, "Is there anything you'd like to say?" could open doors to conversations that seemed impossible for years. Many accounts showed that after a confession or reconciliation, the suffering diminished. It wasn't a miracle, it was humanity. This observation reinforced the importance of listening and being present, even when there are no adequate words to say. In some cases, the greatest help didn't come from medication, but from allowing the person to speak of what they had kept for decades, releasing a burden that wasn't always visible but was there, pressing on the heart and mind. Stevenson made it clear that talking about all of this should not be seen as morbid, but rather as necessary. He believed that reflecting on suffering before death was not giving in to fear, but finding ways to avoid it, or at least soften it. By understanding what might be behind this pain, we open up space for a fuller life, with fewer unresolved matters and more timely dialogues. And perhaps this is the most powerful message of his research. Death doesn't have to be a terror, but it shows us in a raw way the urgency of living more consciously. This understanding, more than any scientific explanation, is what can transform not only how we depart, but also how we live. Stevenson also investigated the effects that past traumatic experiences could have on the last days of life. He noticed that older individuals who had faced wars, domestic violence, abuse, or profound losses carried these memories like invisible scars, and often, as death approached, these episodes resurfaced with unexpected force. The researcher described accounts of former combat veterans who, already frail, would scream in delirium as if they were back on the battlefield, and of women who relived past episodes of pain as if they were recent memories. These moments, to onlookers, seemed merely like mental confusion, but for Stevenson they were signs that the unconscious was trying in some way to process what had never been resolved. He argued that if there had been psychological care throughout life, these wounds would not need to open up so painfully right at the end. Furthermore, Stevenson analyzed how spirituality, or its absence, influenced the way people faced their last moments. He wasn't speaking of specific religions, but of an intimate relationship with something that gave meaning to existence. Elderly individuals who in some way cultivated this connection reported less fear and more acceptance, even in the face of suffering. Those who lived without any reflection on death, however, seemed to be overcome by greater anguish, as if the unknown were an insurmountable abyss. Stevenson saw this as a warning to modern society, which often ignores the topic of death until it imposes itself. He believed that speaking openly about the subject, creating spaces for such conversations, and offering spiritual or emotional support could alleviate pains that medications alone could never touch. Another fundamental point of Stevenson's research was the relationship between regret and pain. In countless interviews, he heard older individuals confessing that they regretted choices, relationships they let slip away, words they never spoke. Regret in these accounts seemed to corrode from the inside out, creating a suffering that no painkiller could cure. The researcher suggested that part of the pain could be reduced if, throughout life, people cultivated the habit of making peace with the past, of reconciling with others and with themselves. He insisted that, while there is still time, it is worth resolving these unfinished matters, because life has a cruel way of presenting the bill when there is no longer breath left to deal with it. Stevenson also brought something surprising to light. In several accounts, the elderly themselves seemed to seek situations that brought symbolic comfort, even if no one around them understood. There were cases of patients who asked to hear a specific song, see an old photograph, or smell a food that reminded them of childhood. For many, these wishes were treated as whims or signs of confusion, but Stevenson saw them as an attempt to regain a sense of belonging and peace before the end. He said that fulfilling these requests, however simple they seemed, could reduce agitation and suffering, because they offered the elder a connection to what was good in their life, a point of light amidst the heaviness of goodbye. The researcher emphasized that, in light of all this, families had an essential role to play. In many cases, the elder's suffering worsened because relatives avoided talking about death, creating a silence fraught with tension. Stevenson suggested that frank conversations, even if difficult, helped alleviate this burden. He said that asking how the person feels, listening to their stories, and even discussing wishes for the final moment did not hasten death, but brought dignity to the process. This stance, however, requires courage because not everyone is willing to face their own fragility. But according to him, it is precisely this courage that allows the transformation of the last days into a moment of true connection, and not just of waiting for the inevitable end. Stevenson did not seek to create a cold theory about death, but rather to offer ways for suffering to be understood, and when possible, alleviated. He said that one does not need to wait for the last days to begin reflecting on all this. On the contrary, the greatest lesson from his research is that life becomes lighter when we learn to talk about what burdens us, to untie knots, to seek peace while we are still journeying. He believed that if more people looked inward and resolved what they could today, fewer elders would face long, painful goodbyes. This view does not eliminate death, but gives it a more human meaning, reminding us that the end of each of us is, in part, shaped by the way we live each day. Stevenson also documented something many families found difficult to accept. Suffering was not always just of the body, but also of the soul. In his conversations with doctors, he discovered that in some cases patients did not feel intense pain, but displayed a deep restlessness, as if something was holding them back here. There was an agitation that did not come from clinical symptoms, but from unresolved emotions. This agitation, when not understood, led to increased medication, which often only silenced important signs. Stevenson argued that, in these moments, listening and dialogue were tools as valuable as medicine, as they helped give voice to what the elder needed to express. He described cases where a simple request for forgiveness, a long-awaited hug, or a conversation postponed for decades brought immediate relief. This showed that, at life's threshold, the pursuit of emotional peace can be as urgent as the relief of physical pain. One aspect he cautiously addressed was the role of family members in how the elderly person experienced their last days. Often, the family carried fears, grievances, or disputes that were reflected in the farewell environment. Stevenson noted that in homes where there were veiled conflicts, tensions over inheritance, or old resentments, suffering seemed to prolong. He didn't speak in an accusatory way, but showed how the atmosphere surrounding the ill person could influence the tranquility of the final moments. He suggested that resolving family conflicts, or at least suspending these disputes, was a way to help the elder depart with more serenity. After all, what he saw repeatedly was that the farewell was never just about the body. It was a reflection of everything life had built, and also of what it had left unfinished. In many testimonies, Stevenson heard phrases that summarized decades of silence. An 88-year-old woman apologized to her son for a mistake she had never mentioned. A 90-year-old man with a weak voice confessed that he had always loved his wife, though he had never said it clearly. These moments were intensely emotional and at the same time profoundly relieving. The researcher described these scenes as doors closing gently after much creaking. The suffering diminished, not because the illness disappeared, but because the soul found space to breathe. For him, these words were proof that what weighs most are not the years lived, but the silences accumulated, and that it is never too late to say what needs to be said. Stevenson also reflected on the impact this suffering has on those left behind. Children, grandchildren, and friends forever carry the memory of how the farewell unfolded, and this memory can be a comfort or a burden. He believed that making the moment of goodbye more humane was a gift given not only to the elder, but to the entire family. Small gestures, such as listening, respecting simple wishes, or offering presents, created lighter memories capable of easing future pain. This transformed the dying process into something less traumatic, allowing those who remained to look back with the feeling that they did what was possible. This understanding helped break the cycle of guilt and regret that so often affects those who witness the departure of a loved one. In the last pages of his research, Stevenson left a direct reflection. Death is inevitable, but unnecessary suffering can be reduced. He did not promise miraculous solutions, but offered a practical perspective. Nurturing relationships, speaking about what hurts, forgiving and seeking forgiveness are not just attitudes for living better. They are ways to prepare for a smoother goodbye. He said that we should not fear talking about death, for by doing so, we learn to live more fully. His work showed that the end does not have to be a moment of terror, but can become a dignified closure, where the last words are of reconciliation, not anguish. This was the lesson he hoped to leave for all who were willing to listen. As we come to the end of this video, it's clear that Stevenson's message isn't about fearing suffering, but about understanding the reasons why it happens and what we can do about it while there's still time. He reminds us that every dialogue initiated today, every broken silence, every gesture of care can make a difference in how we face our last days. If this reflection has touched you, please share this video with someone who might need to hear this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do so to continue receiving content that brings clarity to life's most challenging moments.